How's it everybody? Welcome to Pampata City. Today I have been honored with a guest build by Zardes, Imperial Jedi, Overcharged Egg, Slay and Yumble, who are the regular builders of the series. If you are not aware, 5 Builders 1 City is a project where several builders work gradually expanding a city and multiple other cities on the same map. People like myself get to guest build and add to what is being done. For my build today, I'll be adding a fairly rocky, heavily forested river coming down from the mountains all the way down to the sea. The river will run very close to where Zardes has been building his city, so yeah, I'm kinda super excited to get this going. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Alright, so kicking things off, we will be starting the river at the point where it actually meets the sea. It's simply because it is a whole lot easier to manage the river once you start from kind of the end and work your way all the way back to where the water actually starts from. And this actually makes it a lot easier to manage flooding in and around the area where the river is being placed. So by doing this way, I start with the sources closest to the end because I would have terraformed the area, place the water source and allow it to flow, then work my way back and then terraform and so on. And I generally tend to take this approach because it's easier to not just manage the water but to better plan how the river meanders all the way up to where it starts off. Now, one of the things that I try and do in this is to just try and put 1 or 2 things on the map to sort of force the hands of the next builders. Now, I know, if I remember right, there's a guest builder who's going to be building something in this area. So I've placed this road down as a way of connecting the area that Zardes is building off to whatever gets built towards the top of the screen there. So I try and just place, the odd thing here and there just to break the monotony of just putting down water sources, just putting down trees and bushes and rocks and so on. But when I was first asked what I would like to build here, the first thing that came to mind is at least a bunch of water sources cutting through the landscape. Now, this is a pretty big island from what I recall, and there's one river that separates the main island where the big mountains are from sort of the flattening out of the land. So one of the first things that I thought would be awesome to have is if this mountain that just sits in the middle of this island kind of looks like it's like just giving off a whole lot of water sources. So I proposed quite a few places to have rivers just coming down and sort of fanning out from that one single mountain out to the seas around it. And this is one of the ones that I had proposed. Now, one of the other guest builders made a suggestions of ways to break the monotony of just building a river, which I think is super awesome. But I'm going to keep that under wraps so that if I do get honored with a callback, it is something that I will definitely do at a later stage. But for this, I figured I would put a very long river. So it spans quite a long distance from pretty much the center of the map, and it makes its way all the way down and crosses or goes under this highway that is sort of the main highway connecting pretty much all the cities that are being built. So I terraform in and around the mountain that sits in the middle, which is actually quite nice because it allows me to have a reference point around which I snake the actual river, and then doing my best whilst doing this to not mess around too much with the terraforming that is already there. Now, I was under no strict do not touch our landscape rule or anything like that, but I was trying to preserve as much of the original landscape and map as I could, and then work my way in and around it in terms of placing this river and all the bushes. Now, when I terraform this place, as you can see, the water source starts moving in the opposite direction to what I want, but that is fine. This often happens when you work from the end up to the beginning. But once you place the water sources where they should be, because of the natural slope, at least in terms of how the landscape has been terraformed, that water will push back against the first one that's trying to make its way backwards. As you can see, it slowly starts filling up from the new water sources that I've placed over to the right, and then those then push back on the water until it actually continues to flow in the right direction. Now, certain areas of the river I've made a whole lot more rockier than others, like this area. One of the things that I would have loved to do is to have these rocks kind of work their way all the way up into the mountains. But due to limited assets which I had to work with, I did my best to use what I could. Now, I know the city is being kept to as few assets as possible, which is amazing, because this is the first time I've built something in a very long time where I didn't have to worry about a super low FPS. Actually, the bulk of my cinematics that I recorded were recorded at regular game speed, and I could actually do all of this recording with ULOD actually turned on, which is something I don't know when was the last time I managed to do that. So that is pretty cool. And another thing also is that because of Mr. Mason's trees now being added to the base game, it means you can get all these awesome trees, all this level of detail without having to download too many assets from the workshop. So I quite enjoyed building on here with like as few mods. This is probably the least amount of mods and assets I've ever had to work with, but with all these assets that I do have, I did put in a request to get I think 3 or 4 assets added, which were the decals and a couple of the rock packs to make this happen. And then on this little island here, I thought I would put what looks like an old-ish or an abandoned settlement of some sort. So I got these, or didn't get, these 2 assets, housing assets exist as part of the base game if I'm not mistaken. So I put these down, and then I used the nature path, the nature reserve path, to look like some kind of an old road that cuts through here. But the idea is that this area is fairly well abandoned, and it's all just overgrown with all these grass assets, with, you know, pretty much all these rocks just going crazy around here. Now, this place is very close to the highway, which is just to the bottom of the screen, but I thought I would force the hand to ensure that this isn't like developed over. And with this asset, this path that's going through here, it actually opens the way for some kind of a park or a nature reserve to be built just going off towards the mountains, which is towards the top of the screen, which I think would be a nice addition in the area, depending upon, you know, how the whole place shaped up. But around the river, around the rock assets and everything that's taking place, I wanted the whole landscape here to be quite overgrown. I wanted it to be heavily forested, and I'm sure I killed the FPS a little bit with all of this, but the end result I think looks pretty good. It looks pretty rocky in terms of the river flowing, and yeah, I quite liked how the final result turned out. What I did struggle with though whilst I was doing this is, if you see, the river is back flowing on this side closest towards the bottom, and this is because with the way the two water sources are working, this one that is towards the top right of the screen is meant to be splitting, coming down the river, as well as at the top part of the river. But the flow coming in on the bottom side of the river is not as strong as the one that's going over towards the top. I'm not actually sure why that was the case. But at the end of the day, in order to actually fix that, I had to change how the ground was terraformed around the actual water source point. So I made it go just a little bit deeper than the other side, which increased the rate of flow from the water source itself. And then eventually that increased flow balanced out the flow that we're currently seeing to prevent that backflow of the river. So it took a bit of terraforming and a bit of tinkering around, but eventually I managed to get it to actually all flow in the right direction. Now, the river itself that I built is not 100% realistic, right? There are certain areas that look too deep, there are certain areas that look too shallow, but the look that I really wanted was to have certain areas that appeared to be quite shallow, and in those areas I would put a lot of this dirt decal in the actual river to make it look like the soil of the river is actually highly exposed. And then other areas I was happy to make it look deeper just because it helped control the flow of the river a lot better. So I didn't have too much backflow happening because the water sources are so close to each other. They would often conflict in terms of it pushing backwards and forwards, because once you place a water source, the water goes out in every single direction. So because of that, I had to really kind of jump through a couple of hoops to get the terraforming to work right. So in a place like this where I put down all of these dirt decals, I did that specifically because I noticed that the ground here was shallower than right next to it. So I figured I'll just go for the look that, it's a bit shallower than it actually is. And then here I decreased the actual size of the river itself, because as I start moving closer and closer to the actual water sources, generally you find that the water tends to narrow, and as all the different streams and rivers merge, the eventual river gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It doesn't actually get smaller because there's more water funneling into it. So I try and decrease the size of the actual river a bit just to try and get that look as best as I can. But I had to ensure that the size of the river balanced well with the amount of flow that I wanted, because if I made it too small, then it really looked very unrealistic. And the water source towards the left, because there's a water source right there on the left side of the screen, it will counter the flow of the one at the top. So I made trade-offs. And then as we approached the actual mountain, I took the time to actually do a little bit more terraforming. And I needed to do this because the area here was pretty much perfectly flat. And I was running out of elevation differences that I could use that I could do for the river in order to get a proper flow. So I terraformed the ground a bit to bring it up and then get a gradual slope all the way down to the water source towards the bottom left of the screen there. And then from that point on, I had a lot more elevation to work with, and so I could get a nice gentle slope with everything that has been put together, and then get the different water sources in place and then allow them to flow and actually meet up down quite nicely. I really had to do quite a lot of adjustment with the levels of the water in order to ensure that everything flowed nicely, but in the end I think it came together pretty neat. And then here we get to the actual sources of a lot of the water. Now this is where it looks the most unrealistic, I will admit, and that is because of, I suppose, the nature of the game, that I can only get the water to be so low. So all these water sources, I had set the water levels down to the lowest number that I could, which I think was 0.05. If I went any lower, the water seemed to not like flow properly, like it actually disappeared before it got to the bottom. So I was playing around with what water level would actually work best, and I found 0.05 was the best that would get me a a good enough flow from the top all the way to the bottom, but it does look quite heavy. But at the end of the day, it completes the look. What I would have loved to do is create what looked like a cave system at the point where all the water sources are, but that is probably something for another day. Like, it's something that once we get additional assets added to the game, we can come and create those. So I repeated the process for all 4 sources. I just kind of edited those out so that it's not too repetitive. And then once all of that is done, I placed all of these trees around here just to green up the place a bit, make it look a little bit more lush. And I noticed that I was placing all of these assets by hand. I don't know why I didn't use the tree brush modes to just create a brush and paint over it. But classic me, if I place everything by hand, I think I end up getting a look that is a whole lot more natural, a lot more realistic, and I get to control exactly where the forest is, how everything flows into everything else. So yeah, I really don't mind it. I enjoy placing things down one at a time. And then here where the bulk of the water sources meet, I thought I would make it very, very rocky. The whole idea here is a lot more erosion would have taken place around this area, and so a lot more rock is exposed, but it's still green. In the areas that are green, the forest is rich. I mean, the whole area is rich in nutrients. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of water coming out of the mountains, and so the whole place just comes together nice and green amongst all the rocks that are in this place. So yeah, that is my addition to the city, to this build, let me rather say. I think the river cutting through here has added a little bit of life to it, and it will be cool to see in future what gets developed in and around the river source that is just flowing through. I think the mountainous areas here lends itself very nicely to some mountain resorts and stuff like that. So the stuff that Slay did in the last episode, I think that sort of holiday feel town will play in very nicely to all of us. But yeah, everybody, I want to say thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've not been following the series, definitely check it out. I know there's a playlist on Zardis's channel that has every single episode in it, so catch up with it, follow it. I think it has turned out to be something that is pretty cool. Big thanks again to Zardis and team. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed it, and I seriously hope to come back and continue with my water source expansions. I believe Yumble is next, so check out his channel. He builds super awesome stuff. Thank you all so much. I hope you enjoyed it, and I certainly hope to catch you all in the next one. Cheers everybody.